In this video, we'll look at the rationale for regulating the relationships between the media and its audience in Australia. Now, this is a key knowledge dot point from the VCE Media Study Design, so you must know some of these reasons for regulating. Of course, when we say rationale, we do just mean a set of reasons for regulating. Media regulation 2 is something that we need to define. This is where media content is controlled or guided by government bodies or other institutions apart from the media creators themselves. It includes control over ownership, content, and audience access. This is a pretty broad term that we use in relation to the VCE Media Study Design. However, more commonly, the term's used to describe the legal frameworks that are set around the media's role and responsibilities in society. And so when we think of the reasons for regulating, we need to understand that there are some foundational principles underpinning these very reasons. So the regulation of the media in Australia is based upon the following assumptions or principles: that the media is powerful, that some people in society need to be protected from the harm that the media can cause. And as large and profitable institutions, media organisations have both rights but also responsibilities to the society in which it operates. And then finally, that society of Australian citizens also have rights which need to be protected. And so it's these underlying principles that prompt the 3 reasons for regulating that we'll look at today. Reason 1, protecting vulnerable audiences. As we have already studied, the nature and extent of media influence continues to be debatable, but many do agree that the media has at least the potential to have harmful influence over some members of society. And so media regulation exists to protect these vulnerable audiences who might be susceptible to the influence of the media. When we talk about vulnerable audiences, we typically mean those who might be unable to tell the difference between fiction and reality, audiences who scare easily, lack emotional intelligence, may engage in copycat behaviour when dealing with the media, or just lack the skills to understand how the media operates and how it is trying to persuade or manipulate them. And so when we look at these features of a vulnerable audience, who is it that immediately comes to mind? Of course, it's children, where we can see that children might be consuming media content and then acting it out. And this can raise quite a bit of concern for parents and others in society. And so when people are calling for more strict media regulation, often they cite thinking of the children and making sure that children are protected from seeing things that are perhaps overly violent or overly sexualized. Society wants to protect these vulnerable audiences from consuming content that might be a little bit too mature for them. And of course, in the 21st century, it's not that simple, where in the broadcast era, we traditionally thought of protecting vulnerable audiences from dangerous media content. However, today the media not only produces and distributes content to audience, but it also generates and sustains social networks. And this has contributed to business models based on data aggregation and harvesting of personal information. This is a comment made by the Media Study Design to acknowledge that we no longer need to protect audiences from content, but also regulation today aims to protect these vulnerable audiences from abuse by other individual users, as well as protecting their privacy and keeping their personal information out of the hands of media institutions who might use it for advertising. Reason 2. To promote cultural identity. The Australian media industry is pretty small in comparison to some other nations, and because we are predominantly an English-speaking Western nation, we get much of our media content from larger markets such as Hollywood or the UK. Now, for Australian broadcasters, it's much cheaper to import this ready-made content from overseas than it is to produce our own. But this can lead to a problem. In order to tell Australian stories and keep our local media industry alive, as well as to prevent the Americanization of our society, rules are in place to ensure that local broadcasters have to produce and distribute a set amount of Australian content. As a nation, we want to preserve our cultural identity, and as parents, we want to make sure that our kids are watching content that reflects our nation and its values rather than those of another nation. And so, as a means of promoting cultural identity, in Australia, we have content quotas. Quotas just means a set minimum amount. So we've got content quotas on commercial TV and radio stations that ensure that Australian stories and voices are heard in the media, therefore maintaining a national identity and promoting our local culture or cultures. Commercial TV networks such as 7, 9 and 10 must include a minimum of 55% Australian content between the hours of 6 a.m. and midnight. On top of this, they have to produce a certain amount of children's program. They also need to produce first-run dramas, so that's not repeats or encores. And these have to be produced based on a point system, which includes the hours that it's on the screen, as well as the amount of jobs that are created, the financial investment that goes into the local media industry, the prominence it's given on the network, etc. All of this aims to keep our Australian stories and our Australian media industry current and viable. Reason 3, to uphold community standards. Although regulation aims to protect audiences from the media, it's also open to feedback from this audience in order to gauge what is and what is not acceptable in society at the time. Content that was produced 50, 20, or even 10 years ago may no longer be accepted in our community today. Take, for example, Netflix's recent decision to pull all content made by Chris Lilly, which shows character in blackface. This was a response to the Black Lives Matter movement and increasing unacceptance in our society for casual or institutional displays of racism. This doesn't necessarily mean that all offensive material will be banned, because there is a general appreciation that informed adults can make appropriate decisions about their personal media use. However, there are some limits placed on the content that can be distributed to the public. This is typically content that is extreme and grossly contradicts some of the fundamental standards that we have in our society. So material that might be promoting terrorism or child abuse material are obvious things that no one in our society wants to see in the media. And so, as the VCE Media Study Design says itself, the laws and policies of Australian government and self-regulation by media institutions define mainstream standards through regulatory bodies and codes of conduct. And so, to recap, the rationale for regulation in Australia includes reasons such as protecting the vulnerable audiences who might be susceptible to media influence, such as children, to promote Australian stories and cultural identity while preserving the local media industry, and to uphold the common standards that are already set in our community. Now, these are not the only reasons for regulating the relationship between media and audiences. However, these three are some of the strongest and most robust reasons for having strict rules and regulation when it comes to the media in Australia. So it is important to understand each of these three key reasons.